April 1939. A wooden crate is loaded onto 2 ox carts and pulled 25 miles across Japan to the Naval Air Station at Kagamegahara. Inside the crate, wrapped in cloth and packed with care as if it were made of crystal, is a machine that Jiro Horikoshi has spent 2 years of his life building. His team has averaged 60-hour weeks. He has personally measured rivet tolerances down to fractions of a millimeter. He has fought the Navy's requirements, argued with his superiors, sacrificed sleep and health and certainty because the specifications he was handed in 1937 were widely considered impossible. On April 1st, 1939, the crate is unpacked. The prototype is assembled. It takes to the sky for the first time, and it does something no one expected. It doesn't just meet the requirements, it destroys them. The machine climbs faster, turns tighter, and flies farther than the Navy dared to ask. In its first test flights, it exceeds the top speed specification by more than 10 miles per hour. Its turning radius is unlike anything in Japanese aviation history. The engineers who built it are stunned. The Navy officers who inspect it are speechless. One pilot who flies an early test calls it the most responsive aircraft he has ever touched. That machine will become the Mitsubishi A6M0. It will fly from the first day of the Pacific War to the last. It will accumulate more aerial victories than any other Japanese fighter in history. It will achieve a 12-to-1 kill ratio in its opening months of combat and terrorize Allied pilots across 2 oceans. Commanders who faced it in the early war described it the way soldiers describe a ghost, something that materialized from nowhere, couldn't be held, and was gone before you understood what had happened to you. And here is the thing that will haunt this story from beginning to end. The characteristic that made the Zero unbeatable in that first test flight, the obsession that Horikoshi built into every gram and every bolt, is the exact characteristic that doomed Japan in the air, not despite its perfection, because of it. This is not a simple story about a plane that became obsolete. Every plane becomes obsolete. This is a forensic breakdown of an engineering philosophy so perfectly executed that it couldn't be fixed, a trap so elegantly constructed that it couldn't be escaped, and a paradox that military historians are still writing about today. How do you build the best fighter in the world and lose the air war? To understand the answer, we have to go back to 1937, to a set of requirements that a rival company called impossible, and to a man who decided that impossible was simply a design constraint he hadn't solved yet. Part 1. The Impossible Machine Building a God. The year is 1937. Japan is 2 months into a full-scale war in China, and the Imperial Japanese Navy has a problem. Its current carrier fighter, the Mitsubishi A5M, a neat, capable, but ultimately limited biplane-era monoplane, is struggling to escort bombers deep into Chinese territory. The ranges are too great. The enemy is starting to adapt, and the Navy has just written a new specification for the next generation of fighter that is, by any engineering standard of the day, insane. The new plane must achieve a top speed of at least 500 kilometers per hour. It must climb to 3,000 meters in 3.5 minutes. It must have endurance of 6 to 8 hours at cruise speed with a drop tank. It must carry 2 20mm cannons and 2 7.7mm machine guns. It must be no wider than 12 meters, so it can operate from aircraft carrier decks. And the requirement that made rival manufacturer Nakajima pack up its design team and walk out of the competition entirely, it must be at least as maneuverable as the A5M it was designed to replace. Let that sink in for a moment. They wanted a plane faster than anything currently flying, with the range of a small bomber, the armament of a heavy fighter, and the turning agility of the most maneuverable aircraft in their inventory. Nakajima's engineers ran the numbers, looked at the available engine options, and formally concluded that the specification was physically unachievable. They submitted their withdrawal and went home. Jiro Horikoshi did not go home. Horikoshi was 34 years old when he was assigned as chief designer. He had graduated from the Aviation laboratory at Tokyo Imperial University, spent time studying European aircraft design in Germany and elsewhere, and built a career of meticulous precision. He was not a gambler by temperament. He was a man who believed that if you understood a problem deeply enough, the solution was always there. And after weeks of analysis, he concluded that Nakajima was right. The specification was impossible, unless you made one foundational decision that changed everything. The plane had to be lighter than any combat fighter ever built. Not somewhat lighter, not incrementally lighter. Lighter in a way that had never been attempted, by sacrificing things that every other air force in the world considered non-negotiable. Horikoshi's team drew a line through armor plating for the pilot. They drew a line through self-sealing fuel tanks. They drew a line through any structural redundancy that wasn't absolutely essential to keeping the aircraft in the air under normal combat loads. And then they went further. They obtained access to a new aluminum zinc alloy developed by Sumitomo Metal Industries in 1936, an experimental material called extra super duralumin, stronger and lighter than standard aviation aluminum, but so prone to corrosive brittleness that it required a special anti-corrosion coating just to survive operational use. They engineered the wings and fuselage as a single integrated unit to eliminate the weight of the fittings that normally join them. They used flush riveting across the entire airframe, each rivet set with such precision that the skin felt like polished metal to the touch. They designed the engine mounting to sit unusually close to the cockpit, shortening the rear fuselage and saving weight while simultaneously improving the pilot's control leverage over the entire aircraft. The result, when it first flew in April 1939, weighed approximately 1.68 metric tons empty. The contemporary German Messerschmitt Bf 109, one of the finest fighters in Europe, weighed over 2 metric tons empty with far less range. The American Grumman F-4F Wildcat, which would meet the Zero in its first combat, weighed nearly 2.6 metric tons loaded, and had a combat range of roughly 770 nautical miles. The Zero, with its external drop tank, could fly over 1,600 miles. To put the range in plain terms, American naval analysts, when they first saw Zeros in combat over China and the Philippines, calculated the distances and concluded that Japan must have multiple aircraft carriers they hadn't detected. There was no other explanation for how a carrier-based fighter was appearing so far from any known Japanese ship. They were wrong. There was one explanation. The Zero wasn't supposed to be able to fly that far. Horikoshi had simply made it do it anyway. The Zero entered service with the Imperial Japanese Navy in July 1940. It was immediately sent to China for combat evaluation, and what happened next was so one-sided that Japanese reports were dismissed by Western intelligence as exaggeration. In its first 13 combat sorties over China in September 1940, Zero pilots flying against Chinese Air Force fighters claimed 27 victories with no losses. American military advisors who received translated reports of the Zero's performance in China sent warnings to Washington, and watched those warnings get filed in a drawer. The American dismissal of the Zero wasn't stupidity. It was a reasonable response to the available information. The prevailing Western assumption, deeply embedded and largely unconscious, was that Japan could not have produced a genuinely world-class fighter. The country was seen as capable of competent imitation of Western designs, but not of technical innovation that surpassed them. General Claire Chennault, commanding American volunteer pilots against Japan in China, filed detailed reports about the Zero's capabilities. His reports arrived in Washington in 1941 and were quietly set aside. That dismissal would cost American pilots dearly on December 7th, 1941, and for the following 6 months, Allied fighter pilots across the Pacific would pay the installments. Remember this detail about the Zero's construction, the lightness achieved by removing what every other Air Force kept. Because what Horikoshi took out of the plane didn't just define what it could do, it defined exactly where it would eventually fail. And the man who would eventually find those exact failure points hadn't flown against a Zero yet. He hadn't even seen one. Part 2. The God Has Limits. Finding the Cracks. December 8th, 1941. The Philippines. 45. Zero fighters from the Tainan Air Group launch from Taiwan and begin a 6-hour, 500-mile round trip to attack Clark Air Base north of Manila. Nobody on the Allied side believes this is possible. The range calculation is wrong, American planners conclude. There must be a staging base they don't know about, but there is no staging base. The Zeros land back on Taiwan after the mission with fuel remaining. Among the pilots is a 25-year-old flight petty officer from Saga Prefecture named Saburo Sakai. He is already a decorated veteran of the Chinese campaign, the product of a training system that had accepted 70 students from 1,500 applicants and graduated 25 from that class. He graduated first. Emperor Hirohito personally presented him with a silver watch. On the first day of combat against Americans, Sakai shoots down a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk and destroys 2 B-17 flying fortresses on the ground. He is, in the language of his era, exactly the kind of pilot the Zero was built for. The first months of the Pacific War were everything the Zero's design promised. In the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and Burma, Allied fighters fell in exchange ratios that seemed to confirm the worst fears of the men who'd read Chanot's dismissed reports. Over Ceylon in April 1942, 36 Zeros engaged 60 British aircraft and shot down 27 of them, losing just 1 Zero. The Royal Navy withdrew its carriers from the Indian Ocean entirely. Over the Coral Sea in May and at Midway in June, the Zero dominated every individual engagement it entered. Allied pilots who survived their first Zero encounter came back with the same consistent description. It turns inside you before you can react, and if you try to follow it, you're already dead. But here is what those Allied pilots also noticed, quietly at first, then louder as patterns emerged from the data. The Zero had boundaries, and those boundaries were invisible until you crossed them at the right moment. The first was speed. The Zero's brilliant maneuverability existed in a specific envelope, and that envelope closed sharply as velocity increased. Above approximately 200 knots, roughly 230 miles per hour, the aileron controls began to stiffen dramatically. Without hydraulic boosting, the pilot had to muscle the stick physically against air pressure that increased as the square of speed. At 250 knots, executing a roll required brute force. At 300, the ailerons were described by test pilots as nearly frozen. The Zero that had outturned any fighter alive became, in a high-speed dive, almost impossible to maneuver. The second was directional asymmetry. The Zero's large three-bladed propeller generated significant torque. Combined with the aircraft's extreme lightness, this created a situation where the Zero rolled far more easily to the left than to the right. A snap roll to port happened in an eye blink. The same maneuver to starboard required noticeably more effort and time. In a dogfight measured in fractions of seconds, that difference was not academic. The third was dive behavior. The Zero's light airframe, optimized for low-speed agility, was structurally fragile under the loads generated by high-speed dives. The aircraft had a published VNE, a never-exceed speed, that was lower than many Allied fighters' normal operating speeds. Pilots who pushed the Zero too hard in a dive risked structural failure. Japanese pilots knew this. Allied pilots who discovered it turned it into a tactical weapon. And the fourth, the one that turned any hit into a catastrophe, was the absence of what Horikoshi had removed to achieve his masterpiece. No pilot armor, no self-sealing tanks. A Zero that absorbed a short burst from an American heavy machine gun didn't just take damage, it caught fire. Allied pilots learned that the Zero was one of the most lethal aircraft in the air, and one of the most fragile once your guns found it. The trick was getting it into your sights, which is the hardest thing in the world. But when you did it, a short burst was often enough. The man who first systematized these weaknesses into a teachable doctrine wasn't a scientist or an engineer. He was a 36-year-old Navy pilot from Paris, Tennessee, named John Thatch. In 1941, before he had ever flown against a Zero in combat, Thatch had read a report from the Sino-Japanese War and seen enough in the performance numbers to be alarmed. He sat alone at his kitchen table with a box of matches and spent hours working out fighter tactics on a tabletop, moving matchsticks to represent aircraft formations. What he devised was counterintuitive. He didn't try to match the Zero's turn. He designed a system where two Wildcats would cross and weave toward each other continuously, so that whenever a Zero latched onto one plane's tail, it flew directly into the guns of the other pilot's approaching aircraft. The Zero's superior turn rate was the trap. It allowed it to stay close, which meant the second Wildcat would have a near-perfect shot. He called it the beam defense maneuver. History remembers it as the Thatch Weave. He tested it in mock combat with Ace Edward O'Hare in early 1942. It worked. When he briefed his squadron, some pilots were skeptical. At the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942, Thatch's 6 Wildcats from VF-3 were escorting torpedo bombers when they were bounced by 15 to 20 Zeros. His wingman's radio was immediately shot out. A Wildcat immediately went down in flames. By any conventional analysis, this should have been a slaughter. But Thatch called for the weave, and in the chaos of that engagement, for the first time in the Pacific War, American pilots were killing Zeros faster than the Zero pilots expected. Saburo Sakai, who would encounter the Thatch weave over Guadalcanal weeks later, wrote afterward in his memoir, Samurai, that Japanese pilots were initially confounded by the tactic. His immediate superior, Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, came back from one of the first encounters furious. He had a Wildcat perfectly in his sights. And then another Grumman was coming at him from the side, forcing him to break off or die. The weapon the Zero was built to use, its turn, had been turned into the bait of a trap. The Thatch weave didn't make the Wildcat equal to the Zero. Nothing in 1942 made the Wildcat equal to the Zero. But it broke the certainty. It told pilots that the Zero could be beaten with the right approach, and that information mattered psychologically almost as much as it mattered tactically. Men like Jimmy Thatch didn't survive the Pacific War by being faster or better armed than their opponents. They survived by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. Every like on this video is a small acknowledgement that those men's stories are worth telling, not just the names on the victory boards, but the man who spent his off-duty hours moving matchsticks on a kitchen table because he knew his pilots were going to need an answer before one existed. But Thatch's tactic was still theory confirmed in the chaos of a single battle. What the Americans needed wasn't a workaround for a plane they didn't fully understand. They needed a blueprint. They needed to know exactly what made the Zero tick, and exactly where it broke. And in the summer of 1942, a 19-year-old Japanese pilot would give them that blueprint. He hadn't planned to. He was already dead when they found it. Part 3. The Gift from the Bog. The Akutan Zero. June 4th, 1942. The same day, American dive bombers are sinking 4 Japanese fleet carriers at Midway, the pivot point of the entire Pacific War. A completely separate drama is unfolding in the fog and cold of the Aleutian Islands off the coast of Alaska. It will have no headline that day, but its consequences will reach into every cockpit of every American fighter for the rest of the war. Petty Officer, First Class. Tadayoshi Koga is 19 years old. In a service photo taken at some point before the mission, he looks directly at the camera with the quiet confidence of a young man who has been told he is flying the finest fighter on Earth, and who has no particular reason to doubt it. He is part of the Aleutian Diversion Force, a secondary operation meant to draw American attention north, while Yamamoto's main fleet moves on Midway. On the morning of June 4th, Koga launches from the carrier Ryujo as part of a 3-plane section assigned to strafe Dutch harbor. The attack goes as planned. Koga and his wingmen strafe the American base. During the attack, small arms fire from ground defenses hits Koga's Zero. Specifically, the fatal shot severs the return oil line. Oil begins streaming from the aircraft. The engine will seize if he pushes it. Koga reduces throttle and radios that he's heading for the emergency landing zone, a small island called Akutan, 25 miles to the east, where a Japanese submarine is waiting to pick up downed pilots. His wingmen, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tsuguo Shikata, follow him. They circle above as Koga surveys a broad, flat area half a mile inland from the shore. The grass looks firm. Koga lowers his landing gear and makes his approach. But Shikata, on his second pass overhead, sees something that makes his stomach drop. A glint, moisture reflecting from beneath the grass. Not a firm field, a marsh. He has no way to communicate this to Koga in time. Koga's Zero touches down. The wheels sink instantly into the waterlogged earth. The plane flips over onto its back with a splash. The impact breaks Koga's neck. He dies instantly, Both wingmen had standing orders to destroy any Zero that might fall into enemy hands. They circled, watching the upturned plane. They couldn't be certain Koga was dead. They couldn't bring themselves to strafe what might have been a trapped friend. After circling twice, they turned and flew back to the Ryujo, which would itself be sunk 2 months later. Koga's wingman Endo would be killed in action over Rabaul in October 1943. Shikata survived the war and became a banker. Koga's Zero lay in the Aleutian bog, invisible in the fog and mist for 36 days. On July 10, 1942, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina patrol bomber was returning to Dutch Harbor by dead reckoning after becoming briefly lost. Navigating back to his proper course over Akutan Island, a gunner named Wall looked down through a gap in the clouds. "Hey," he called out over the intercom, "there's an airplane on the ground down there. It has meatballs on the wings." The Rising Sun insignia. Recovery teams were dispatched. When they reached the site, they found the Zero had spent 36 days upside down in an Aleutian bog and was in astonishing condition. The engine was intact, the instruments were readable, the airframe was structurally sound. Koga was still in the cockpit and was given a respectful burial on the island. Recovery teams carefully documented everything, loaded the aircraft onto a barge on July 15th, and shipped it to Naval Air Station San Diego. After careful restoration, a process that revealed an engineering quality that visibly impressed American technicians, it was flying again by September 20th, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders made the first test flight that day. He would go on to fly 24 flights in Koga's Zero between September 20th and October 15th, 1942. 46 years later, he still remembered every one of them. The very first flight exposed weaknesses of the Zero which our pilots could exploit with proper tactics, Sanders told historian Jim Reardon. The Zero had superior maneuverability only at the lower speeds used in dogfighting, with short turning radius and excellent aileron control at very low speeds. However, immediately apparent was the fact that the ailerons froze up at speeds above 200 knots, so that rolling maneuvers at those speeds were slow and required much force on the control stick. It rolled to the left much easier than to the right. The report also confirmed the engine quirk that some combat pilots had noticed and exploited. The Zero's carburetor-style fuel system, unlike American fuel injection systems, would cut out under negative G forces. If an American pilot pushed his nose sharply down to dive, the engine kept running. If a Zero pilot did the same, the engine sputtered. The difference lasted only seconds, but seconds were the unit of measurement in this war. The tactical implications of Sanders' report were immediately distributed across the fleet. The prescribed counter to a Zero behind you was now specific. Enter a high-speed dive, roll hard to the right. The Zero couldn't follow at that speed without its ailerons freezing. If it tried to follow and pushed negative G, its engine would momentarily cut out. And right rolling was always harder for the Zero than left rolling. Every one of Koga's secrets was now a training bulletin. Marine Captain Kenneth Walsh used that information directly. Walsh would end the war with 21 aerial victories over Japanese aircraft, 17 of them Zeros, and received the Medal of Honor for 2 missions over the Solomons in August 1943. He described it afterward with the precision of a craftsman. With a Zero on my tail, I did a split S, and with its nose down and full throttle, my Corsair picked up speed fast. I wanted at least 240 knots, preferably 260. Then, as prescribed, I rolled hard right. As I did this and continued my dive, tracers from the Zero zinged past my plane's belly. From information that came from Koga's Zero, I knew the Zero rolled more slowly to the right than to the left. If I hadn't known which way to turn or roll, I'd have probably rolled left, and I'd have probably been dead. One 19-year-old pilot who never intended to give the Americans anything had handed them a complete diagnostic of their most dangerous enemy. The aircraft that made it possible for Koga's body to reach Akutan at all, that gave his crippled plane enough range to find a landing site after the oil line was cut, was the same aircraft whose secrets now sat in a Navy report being read by every Pacific fighter pilot who would face the Zero for the next 3 years. The Zero's greatest asset had delivered its most dangerous liability, but the Americans now had a playbook. What happened next should have been straightforward. Kill the Zero with the right tactics, introduce better planes, win the air war, and in one sense, that is exactly what happened. But the story has a layer underneath it that the history books tend to gloss over, because the real destruction of Japan's air power wasn't about tactics or technology. It was about something far harder to replace than a fighter plane. It was about the men inside the cockpits, and Japan was about to run out of them in a way that couldn't be undone. Part 4. The Bleeding Sky. Japan runs out of pilots. Here is a number that doesn't look dramatic at first. In 1937, out of 1,500 Japanese sailors who applied for the Navy's pilot trainee program, 70 were accepted. 25 graduated. Every single one of those 25 graduates was, by definition, extraordinary. They had been selected from a pool wider than almost any other military program in the world, measured against standards that washed out more than 96% of applicants, and then trained for years before they ever entered a cockpit with a combat aircraft. The system produced pilots like Saburo Sakai, like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the ace of aces Sakai described in his memoir as looking like a man who should be in a hospital bed, tall and gaunt for a Japanese man, perpetually ill with malaria and tropical skin disease, ribs protruding through his skin, who was nonetheless credited with 87 or more aerial victories, and flew with such eerie precision that his fellow pilots gave him a nickname, the Devil. These men were the product of years of investment in the most intensive pilot training program on Earth, and Japan burned through them like kindling. The problem was structural and strategic. Japan's military leadership had designed its entire air war around the assumption of a short conflict. They had built an elite corps of pilots so skilled that a small number of them could achieve decisive results quickly. There was no reserve. There was no second tier. When the war did not end quickly, when the American carrier forces survived Midway and began counterattacking across the Solomons, the irreplaceable veterans were simply left in the line until they died. Consider the arithmetic. At Pearl Harbor in December 1941, approximately 750 experienced Japanese carrier pilots participated in the attack. By October 1942, 10 months later, roughly 400 of them were dead. In those 10 months, Japan had fought the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, and the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. Each engagement consumed veterans at a rate the training pipeline was never designed to replace. The Battle of Midway alone, on June 4th to 7th, 1942, the same days Koga's Zero was settling into the Aleutian Marsh, cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and 234 aircraft. What the loss count in machines obscures is what the loss count in men meant. The carrier pilots who died at Midway had accumulated thousands of hours of flight time over years of training and combat. The system that produced them required selecting 1 in 60 applicants and training those survivors for multiple years. Japan could not replace them. The timeline was simply impossible. The Guadalcanal campaign, which began in August 1942 and ran into February 1943, accelerated the hemorrhage. Japanese fighter pilots based at Rabaul flew missions to Henderson Field that covered more than 600 miles round trip, right at the edge of even the Zero's extraordinary range. The daily air battles over Guadalcanal killed Japanese pilots at a rate that left commanders openly despairing. Over the 6-month campaign, Japan lost over 600 aircraft, and far more critically, the irreplaceable experienced men who flew them. Saburo Sakai had his own August 7th over Guadalcanal. On that day, his Zero took a burst from the rear gunner of an SBD Dauntless dive bomber, a gunner named Harold Jones, that shattered his canopy and drove a bullet fragment through his skull, partially blinding his right eye and leaving the left side of his body temporarily paralyzed. Sakai, bleeding profusely, disoriented, and running on shock-induced adrenaline, made a decision that is still cited in aviation history as one of the most extraordinary feats of airmanship ever documented. He flew his damaged 560 miles back to Rabaul, alone, for nearly 5 hours. He flew upside down in intervals to keep the blood from his right eye flooding his left. When he could no longer see, He opened the throttle and dropped the nose, letting the rush of cold air clear his head enough to locate the horizon. He nearly ran out of fuel on approach. He circled the Rabaul airfield 4 times before his remaining vision aligned him with the runway. He landed. Ground crews helped him out of the cockpit. He refused to go to the hospital until he had made his mission report. The doctors at Yokosuka Naval Hospital told Sakai he was permanently blind in his right eye and would never fly combat again. He spent a year recovering and then spent another year training replacement pilots, work that left him visibly shaken by what he found. He wrote in his memoir about the new generation of student pilots, young men who often outranked veteran instructors through patronage or family connections, who were arrogant about their theoretical training and unskilled in the actual handling of their aircraft. We couldn't watch for individual errors and take the long hours necessary to weed the faults out of a trainee, he recalled. Hardly a day passed when fire engines and ambulances did not race down the runways, sirens shrieking, to dig one or more pilots out of the plane they had wrecked on a clumsy takeoff or landing. This is the hidden second front of the war against the Zero, not the battle over Guadalcanal, or the Solomons, or New Guinea. The battle at the flight schools in Japan, where the replacement pipeline was producing in months what the pre-war system had taken years to build, and where the shortfall between what was needed and what was possible was growing wider with every carrier engagement. By the middle of 1943, Allied pilots were noticing a qualitative change in their opponents. The engagements that had been lethally equal or worse in 1942 were becoming more one-sided. Not because the Zero had changed, because the men flying it had. And then the Hellcat arrived. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat reached Pacific combat units in August 1943. It was everything the Zero wasn't in the ways that now mattered. 2,000 horsepower to the Zero's 1,130. A top speed of 380 miles per hour to the Zero's 335. Over 200 pounds of cockpit armor. Self-sealing fuel tanks. 6 heavy .50 caliber machine guns. Its designers had studied the Zero thoroughly, including data from the Akutan tests, and built a plane specifically designed to kill it. The Hellcat was not as maneuverable at slow speeds as the Zero. It was also not trying to be. It was trying to be fast enough to dictate engagements, armored enough to take hits, and powerful enough to turn any angle into an advantage. The Hellcat's kill ratio against Japanese aircraft overall, across the entire Pacific War, would eventually reach 19-1. But those statistics came later. In late 1943 and early 1944, what mattered was the combination. A genuinely superior aircraft, flown by 2 years' worth of well-trained American pilots, fighting against the Zero, flown by pilots who had often spent less than 4 months in training before being declared combat ready. If your father or grandfather served in any branch of the military during the Pacific War, if they flew Wildcats off Guadalcanal, served on a carrier during the Philippine Sea, or were anywhere in that theater, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. Which ship? Which squadron? What theater? Those specific memories belong to people, and they matter more than anything in an archive. Please share them. By June 1944, the equation had been running against Japan for 2 years. The veteran pilots were mostly dead or grounded with wounds. The replacement pilots had a fraction of the training. The Zero was increasingly facing aircraft that outperformed it in every category except slow-speed turning. And on June 19, 1944, all of those compounding disasters arrived at the same place at the same time. What happened next is the most mathematically lopsided air battle in the history of naval warfare. And it is the moment where Horikoshi's engineering obsession, Sakai's wounds, Koga's crash, and 2 years of Japan's institutional failure all arrived at a single conclusion. Part 5. The Turkey Shoot and the Verdict. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commands 9 aircraft carriers and their air groups in what Japanese naval planners have designated Operation Eigo, the decisive battle that will break American carrier power before it can reach the Japanese home islands. He has approximately 430 to 450 aircraft. The American Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher has 900 aircraft on 15 carriers. On paper, this is a carrier battle. In practice, it is the forensic convergence of every decision made about the Zero since 1937. At 7:30 in the morning, Ozawa launches his first wave, 69 aircraft, including Zeros. American radar picks them up at 150 miles. Fighter director officers on the carrier's vector, Hellcats to altitude with 14 minutes of advance warning, something that would have been impossible in 1942. The Zeros that had once materialized from fog without warning are now watched from the moment they leave their carriers, tracked every mile of their approach, and met at altitude by aircraft that can outrun them in a dive and outgun them with 6 heavy machine guns. The first wave loses 42 aircraft of 69. The second wave, 128 aircraft, loses 97. The third wave of 47 loses all but 7. The fourth wave of 82 aircraft, misdirected near American air bases, loses all but 9. Over the course of the day, Japan launches approximately 326 carrier aircraft against Task Force 58. American Hellcat pilots and anti-aircraft gunners knock down close to 300 of them. Total Japanese aircraft losses over the 2 days of the engagement, including land-based aircraft and those lost in the American counterstrike that evening, reach approximately 480. American aircraft losses are 123. The majority of those lost not in combat, but in the darkwater landings attempted that night when fuel-exhausted pilots tried to find carrier decks in a moonless sea. The airmen who survived named the engagement themselves. A shipmate of Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vracciu, watching the last aircraft land that evening, said what everyone was thinking. It was just like an old-time turkey shoot. Vracciu had returned from the morning engagement holding up 6 fingers to Admiral Mitcher, standing above him on the carrier Lexington's flight deck. 6 Japanese aircraft shot down in 8 minutes, using 360 rounds of ammunition. He was grinning in the photograph that would run in newspapers across America, the grin of a man who had just confirmed everything the training promised. On the other side, a pilot who survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea and lived long enough to write about it, described what it had felt like from inside a Zero cockpit. You launched against an enemy force expecting a battle. What you found was a wall. The American radar saw you coming from 150 miles. The Hellcats were waiting at your altitude or above it. The radio coordination was flawless. The shooting was precise and relentless. Everything you could do to survive, turn, climb, dive, was anticipated. When you turned tightly at low speed, the Hellcat simply climbed away and came back from altitude. When you dove, it followed without difficulty because its pilot didn't have to fight his ailerons to roll. The only escape was to run, and you couldn't outrun a Hellcat. The Japanese Naval Air Force that emerged from the Battle of the Philippine Sea was, in practical terms, finished as a coherent fighting force. The veterans who remained from 1941 and 1942 could be counted. The replacement pilots had neither the training hours nor the experience to fill the void. And the Zero, now clearly outclassed in speed, power, and protection, had no successor ready. Horikoshi's team had known this was coming. The same design philosophy that made the Zero impossible to replace quickly, the obsessive lightness, the refusal to include structural margins that would allow for adaptation, meant that the Zero could not be meaningfully upgraded to keep pace with the Hellcat and Corsair. Every attempt to add armor, self-sealing tanks, or a more powerful engine ran into the same wall. The airframe was already stretched to the limit of its structural integrity. Adding weight took away the turn. Adding power to compensate for added weight required a bigger engine, which weighed more. The performance envelope that Horikoshi had created through years of brilliance was also a cage. There's a document that captures this moment better than any battle report. During the final year of the war, as B-29s began burning Japanese cities, and the Hellcats owned the sky over the home islands, Horikoshi kept a personal diary. He wrote in it with the bluntness of a man who had stopped pretending. Since then, the majority of us who had truly understood the awesome industrial strength of the United States never really believed that Japan would win this war. We were convinced that surely our government had in mind some diplomatic measures which would bring the conflict to a halt before the situation became catastrophic for Japan. But now, Bereft of any strong government move to seek a diplomatic way out, we are being driven to doom. The man who had built the finest fighter Japan ever fielded had never believed his creation would win the war it was made for. The Zero's final chapter is its most haunting. As Japan ran out of options in 1944 and 1945, planners looked at their inventory and made a calculation. The Zero was no longer competitive as a conventional fighter against Hellcats and Corsairs, but it still flew, it still had range, and it could carry a bomb. Of the 2,363 Japanese Navy aircraft that participated in kamikaze special attack missions in the final year of the war, 1,189 were Zeros, exactly 50.3%. The plane that Horikoshi had said he wanted to make beautiful was used to destroy pilots along with everything else. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the devil himself, Japan's ace of aces, did not die in a Zero cockpit. He died as a passenger on an unarmed transport aircraft on October 26, 1944, shot down by American Hellcats over the Philippines. He had just delivered Zero fighters to a kamikaze unit. The greatest Zero pilot in Japanese history was killed in a plane that couldn't fight back, flying in from a mission he never would have chosen. He was 30 years old. Saburo Sakai survived the war. He lost his right eye forever and never flew combat in a Zero again after Guadalcanal. He returned to Japan, became a Buddhist, and opened a small printing shop where he employed veterans who couldn't find work elsewhere. He met Harold Jones, the American gunner who shot him over Guadalcanal, near Los Angeles in 1983, and they exchanged gifts. Sakai brought the flying helmet he'd worn that August day in 1942, still bearing the hole Jones's bullet had made. In his later years, he became a motivational speaker in Japanese schools, his theme always the same: never give up. He died in 2000 at the age of 84 of a heart attack shortly after a formal dinner at a U.S. Navy base in Japan. The verdict. So here is the final audit. The Zero was, by the objective metrics of 1940 aviation, the finest carrier-based fighter ever built. Its range was revolutionary. Its turn was lethal. Its construction was a masterpiece of engineering precision. Britain's chief test pilot, Captain Eric Brown, flew it after the war and said, "I don't think I have ever flown a fighter that could match the rate of turn of the Zero." It ruled the roost totally and was the finest fighter in the world until mid-1943. And yet, Japan lost the air war decisively. By June 1944, its naval air force had been effectively destroyed. By the final months of the war, its pilots were flying suicide missions in the same plane that had ruled the Pacific 4 years earlier. Why? Not one reason. A cascade of reasons, each flowing from the same source. Horikoshi built the Zero for a philosophy of war that assumed agility was the supreme virtue of a fighter, that the ability to outturn an opponent was the decisive characteristic, the one around which all other decisions should be organized. That philosophy was correct in 1940. It became a cage by 1943 because the same lightness that created the turn prevented the structural upgrades that would have allowed the Zero to survive the shift in the balance of power. The plane couldn't be fixed because fixing it destroyed what made it what it was. The Japanese pilot training system built on the same philosophy. Elite by selection, exceptional by development, irreplaceable by nature. It was correct for a short war. It was catastrophic for a long one. When Midway and Guadalcanal burned through those veterans, there was no second tier. The system could not scale because it was not designed to scale. It was designed to produce Saburo Sakai. It could not produce enough of him. And the Zero itself, the machine that had to be light to be magnificent, could not carry the armor that would have kept those irreplaceable pilots alive. Every pilot lost in a Zero that caught fire from a single burst, every veteran who died because a bullet found a fuel tank without a self-sealing liner, was a pilot the training system could not replace in less than years. The obsession that built the Zero was the obsession that doomed it. Horikoshi had wanted to make something beautiful, as he wrote later, and he had. But beauty built on the exclusion of resilience is fragile. And in the Pacific, the war became a test of resilience. American industrial resilience, American training resilience, American institutional resilience. that Japan's beautiful, fragile, irreplaceable machine was not designed to survive. Tadayoshi Koga is buried today, most likely, in Chidoriga-Fuchi National Cemetery in Japan, among 223 unidentified remains from the Pacific War. No one is certain which grave is his. The 19-year-old who handed American analysts the blueprint for defeating his own country's greatest fighter will probably never be definitively identified. His Zero was destroyed in a training accident in February 1945, struck in the taxiway by a runaway helldiver that sliced it into pieces. Its bones are distributed among a few museums. The Alaska Aviation Heritage Museum holds a fragment. The National Museum of the United States Navy has some gauges salvaged from the wreckage. A plane that changed the course of the war ended as spare parts in a box. Jiro Horikoshi lived until January 1982. He received the Order of the Rising Sun, 3rd class, from his government. He wrote his memoir. He watched Hayao Miyazaki make the film The Wind Rises about his life, in which the closing dream sequence shows him mourning the Zero fighters as beautiful, cursed dreams. When Miyazaki learned that Horikoshi had once said, "All I wanted to do was to make something beautiful," he knew he had the heart of his film. In the end, that is the Zero's epitaph. It was beautiful. It was the most maneuverable carrier fighter the world had ever seen. And the engineering obsession that made it beautiful, the absolute, uncompromising, brilliant refusal to accept any weight that wasn't necessary, became the reason it couldn't survive the war it helped start. The plane that flew from the first day to the last was doomed by its first great success. The obsession that built it couldn't save it, because in 1940, Jiro Horikoshi had solved the problem Japan wanted him to solve. He just couldn't know yet that the problem would change. If this forensic breakdown gave you something to think about, if you found value in putting these pieces together, hit that like button. It helps this analysis reach the people who care about getting the history right, not just the version that got written in the headlines. Subscribe if you want the next chapter in this series, because the story of how American industrial engineering answered Japan's engineering genius is one of the most important and least fully told stories of the Pacific War. And remember, the Zero was not defeated by a better plane alone. It was defeated by what the men who built it had refused to include in it, the margins that would have allowed it to adapt. In engineering, as in war, the perfect is sometimes the enemy of the survivable.